Hey guys, tonight we're gently pushing open a creaky, iron-studded door into a world that's both strangely familiar and yet profoundly different from our own. A world where the simple act of reading a signpost, a letter, or even a public notice was a rare skill, and owning a book was akin to possessing a treasure chest. Tonight, we're venturing beyond the grand narratives of Renaissance Enlightenment and religious Reformation to explore how Johannes Gutenberg's clanking, ingenious printing press began to quietly, almost stealthily, change the very texture of daily life for ordinary people in late medieval Europe. Imagine the sheer, painstaking effort required just to get a single piece of news or a simple story copied and shared. If you were suddenly thrust back into the 14th century without your instant access to information, without even a cheaply printed ballad sheet, you probably won't survive this level of information scarcity without developing some serious patience, or perhaps taking up a new hobby like competitive turnip carving to pass the endless, newsless hours. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please do let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your neck of the woods. It's always a joy to see how far these stories travel across our digitally connected globe. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing in a world that moves at the pace of a plodding ox cart, at least when it comes to the dissemination of the written word. We're in Europe, perhaps in the early to mid-15th century, just before the metallic song of the printing press begins to resonate. For the vast majority of people you see around you, the farmer in his field, the blacksmith at his forge, the weaver at her loom, even many of the merchants in the bustling town square, the world of letters is a distant, almost alien realm. Literacy is a specialized tool, largely confined to the clergy, the nobility, royal administrators, a growing class of urban professionals, and, of course, the dedicated scribes whose entire existence revolves around the painstaking creation of written documents. Step into a medieval scriptorium, very likely nestled within the thick, protective walls of a monastery, an island of quiet industry in a largely unlettered sea. The air is cool, perhaps a little damp, carrying the distinct, earthy aroma of processed animal skins, parchment, and the slightly acrid metallic scent of iron gall ink. Light is a precious commodity, filtering in through narrow, often unglazed windows, or supplied by the flickering, smoky flame of a tallow candle or an oil lamp. You see monks, their heads bent in intense concentration over sturdy wooden desks, each one engaged in the slow, meticulous act of transcribing a text. Their only tools are a sharpened quill, likely from a goose or swan, a knife for scraping away errors and for resharpening the quill, a horn of ink, and perhaps a ruler and all for pricking out guidelines on the parchment. Every single letter is formed by hand, copied from an exemplar manuscript that lies open beside them. It is an act of devotion, of scholarship, and of incredible physical endurance. Imagine copying out the entire Bible, with its intricate verses and chapters, letter by painstaking letter. A historical fact that truly underscores the labor involved a skilled scribe might produce only a few pages of high-quality text in a single day. Completing a substantial volume like a Psalter or a Book of Hours could take months. A full Bible could easily consume a year or more of a single scribe's dedicated effort. This, naturally, made manuscripts incredibly expensive. They were luxury items, commissioned by wealthy patrons, powerful church figures, or institutions like universities. The idea of a common person owning a personal library, or even a single book for leisure reading, was almost laughably out of reach. Your average peasant's most valuable possession was more likely to be a good cooking pot or a sturdy pair of shoes, not a vellum-bound volume of Ovid. The materials themselves contributed to the cost. Parchment, the primary writing surface, was made from the treated skins of sheep, goats, or calves. It was durable, yes, but preparing it was a lengthy, smelly process involving soaking, scraping, stretching, and smoothing. A large book might require the skins of an entire flock. Inks had to be carefully compounded from ingredients like oak galls growths on oak trees caused by wasps, iron sulfate, and gum arabic for black ink, or from various minerals and organic substances for colored inks used in decorations and illuminations. These illuminations, the beautiful, often intricate, hand-painted illustrations and decorative capitals that adorned many medieval manuscripts, were a specialized art form in themselves, often executed by different artists after the scribe had finished the text. They added immensely to the beauty and the price of the finished work. You didn't just dash off an illuminated manuscript, it was a collaborative, resource-intensive creation. Because of this scarcity and value, knowledge was, in many ways, hoarded. Libraries, such as they were, often chained their precious manuscripts to lecterns to prevent theft, an early, rather unsubtle form of DRM, you might say. Access was restricted. A quirky tidbit that illustrates the preciousness of writing materials is the practice of creating palimpsests. When a text was no longer needed, or if parchment was in short supply, a scribe might carefully scrape away the old ink from a manuscript and write a new text on the recycled surface. Modern imaging techniques have allowed scholars to recover some of these erased undertexts, revealing lost classical works, earlier versions of religious writings, or even mundane records hidden beneath later layers of script. It's like an archaeological dig, but on a single sheet of ancient skin. Historians continue to explore and debate the precise levels of functional literacy among different social groups in the preprint era. While the stereotype of a universally illiterate peasantry might be an oversimplification, some individuals in various walks of life certainly possessed basic reading or mark-making skills for practical purposes. Widespread, fluent literacy as we understand it was undeniably rare. This reality profoundly shaped daily life. News traveled orally. Laws were proclaimed rather than read by the populace. Stories were told and retold, and memory played a far more crucial role in preserving and transmitting information than it does for most of us today. This was the quiet, handwritten world, poised on the edge of a transformation that would amplify the power of the word beyond anyone's wildest imaginings. You're still immersed in that late medieval European world, where each word committed to parchment is a small act of labor and a significant investment. The scriptoria are humming with the quiet scratch of quills. But now, shift your focus to a bustling town in the Rhine Valley of Germany, the city of Mainz. Sometime around the mid-1440s and into the 1450s. There's a different kind of hum here, a more metallic, industrious sound, emanating from a workshop where a goldsmith and entrepreneur named Johannes Gensfleisch zur Laden zum Gutenberg, or Gutenberg, as history prefers to call him, is wrestling with a set of ideas that will, quite literally, imprint themselves onto the future of humanity. This isn't just about making books more easily. It's about unleashing a force that will subtly, and then dramatically, reconfigure the very currents of daily life. Gutenberg, as we mentioned, didn't invent printing out of thin air. Woodblock printing, where a whole page of text and images is carved in relief onto a wooden block, inked, and pressed onto paper, had been known in Europe for some time. Having made its way from East Asia, it was used for creating things like playing cards, religious images for popular devotion, often called block books, if they contained a sequence of such images with minimal text, and even some very short, simple texts. A mainstream historical fact is that by the early 15th century, woodblock printing was a recognized, if somewhat limited, craft in Europe. However, carving a new block for every single page was still incredibly time-consuming and not suitable for lengthy or complex texts. Moreover, the wooden blocks wore out relatively quickly. It was better than hand copying for producing multiple identical images, but it wasn't the revolution the world was waiting for. The true genius of Gutenberg, and what historians often call the Gutenberg Revolution, lay in his development and integration of several key innovations into a viable, efficient printing system. The most crucial of these was movable metal type. This involved creating individual, reusable letter forms cast with precision from a durable metal alloy, likely a mix of lead, tin, and antimony, which had a low melting point and cast well. Each letter, number, and punctuation mark was a separate piece. These pieces could be arranged and locked into a frame, called a form, or to create a full page of text. Once the printing was done, the type could be cleaned and redistributed back into a type case, ready to be used again for a completely different page. This reusability was the game changer. No more carving an entire page block, now you could compose, print, and recompose with relative speed. It's like the difference between sculpting a message in sand every time versus having a set of letter-shaped pebbles you can rearrange endlessly. One is ephemeral art, the other is a communication system, alongside the movable type. Gutenberg also perfected a suitable oil-based ink. The water-based inks used for hand copying or woodblock printing didn't adhere well to metal type. He needed an ink that was viscous enough to stick to the metal surfaces, transfer cleanly to paper under pressure, and dry relatively quickly. His goldsmithing background, with its knowledge of metallurgy and chemical processes, likely aided him here. And then there was the press itself. He adapted the existing screw press technology, used for centuries in agricultural applications like pressing grapes for wine or olives for oil, and also in papermaking, to create a machine that could apply firm, even pressure to transfer the ink from the form of type to the paper. You can picture him and his team in their mind's workshop, the clinking of metal as type was set, the acrid smell of the forge where type was cast, the rhythmic creak and thud of the press arm being pulled, and the careful peeling back of a freshly printed sheet to examine the impression. It would have been a period of intense experimentation. Financial stress. Gutenberg famously had disputes with his financial backers, like Johann Fust, and probably more than a few inky smudges on frustrated faces. Not enough antimony in this batch, Hans. The serifs are crumbling again, and for goodness sake, stop using my best wine press for your inky experiments. The most famous product of this endeavor, of course, is the Gutenberg Bible, also known as the 42-line Bible, completed around 1454 or 1455. It was a triumph of early printing, a magnificent 2-volume Latin Bible produced in an edition of perhaps 180 copies, some on paper, some on more luxurious vellum. While still an expensive item, far beyond the reach of ordinary individuals, its production demonstrated the power and potential of the new technology. To create 180 copies of such a massive work by hand would have taken a scriptorium of scribes many years, if not decades. Gutenberg's press achieved it in a fraction of that time, and with remarkable consistency from one copy to the next. A quirky, or rather impressive tidbit, is the sheer artistry that went into the Gutenberg Bible. Although printed space was left for handcrafted illuminated initials and decorations to be added later by traditional artists, thus blending the new technology with established manuscript aesthetics. It was a bridge between two worlds. Historians still engage in scholarly debate about the exact timeline of Gutenberg's developments. The specific contributions of his associates like Fust and Peter Schoeffer, and whether similar experiments with movable type were occurring independently elsewhere in Europe around the same time. For instance, Lawrence Janzoon Koster in Haarlem is a recurring, though less substantiated, claimant. However, the consensus is that Gutenberg's workshop in Mainz was where all the necessary elements, durable metal type, suitable ink, and an efficient press, were first successfully combined into a practical and commercially viable system for mass textual reproduction. The press had truly awakened, and though its initial products were often aimed at the existing elite market for books, the seeds of a much broader transformation in daily life, in how ordinary people would eventually encounter and interact with the written word, had been firmly and inkily planted. The world was about to get a lot more textual. Gutenberg's press has made its grand debut with those stunning, if still rather inaccessible, Bibles. But you can't build a revolution on luxury items alone. The true quiet, creeping change in daily life began when printers realized the immense potential of their new machines to churn out not just hefty tomes, but also vast quantities of cheap, ephemeral single-sheet items and small pamphlets. These affordable sheets were the print equivalent of a quick snack rather than a formal banquet, easily digestible, widely accessible, and designed for immediate consumption. And it's through these humble, often overlooked, pieces of paper that the printing press first started to truly infiltrate the everyday awareness of the masses. Long before personal libraries became a common aspiration, imagine yourself in a bustling market square or a crowded churchyard in a European town. Perhaps in the latter half of the 15th century or the early 16th, the air is thick with the sounds of commerce, conversation, and perhaps a town crier shouting out the latest news. But now, something new is added to this sensory mix, the sight of printed sheets of paper being sold by itinerant peddlers, hawked by street criers, or posted on public surfaces. These are the broadsides, the pamphlets, the single-leaf woodcuts, the indulgences, the popular currency of the early printing press. For just a pfennig, a sou, or a farthing, you might be able to purchase a piece of this new magic. It's like when the first cheap paperbacks appeared after centuries of expensive hardcovers. Suddenly, owning a piece of the written or pictured word was within reach of a much wider audience. Broadsides were one of the earliest and most impactful forms of this popular print. A broadside is essentially a large, single sheet of paper, printed on one side only, designed to be posted publicly or read aloud. What kind of information did they carry? Anything and everything that might grab public attention. It could be an official government proclamation, a new law, or a royal decree, like we touched upon before. But just as often, it was something far more sensational. News of a recent battle often wildly exaggerated in its heroism or villainy. The report of a monstrous birth 2 heads scales a tale. A dire prophecy about an impending comet or plague, or a lurid account of a notorious crime and the subsequent execution of the villain. These were designed to shock, to entertain, to inform however inaccurately, and most importantly, to sell. The printer who could produce a broadside about a truly spectacular local scandal probably did a roaring trade for a few days. Step right up, get your freshly printed account of Farmer Giles's talking pig. Only 1 penny predicts the weather. It does. Then there were the pamphlets. These were small, unbound booklets, typically ranging from just a few pages to perhaps a couple of dozen. Their cheapness and portability made them ideal vehicles for spreading ideas quickly. As the religious and political turmoil of the Reformation and beyond began to simmer and then boil over, pamphlets became the primary medium for polemical debate. Martin Luther, as we've noted, was a master of the form. His fiery tracts and sermons reproduced in tens of thousands of copies, reaching an audience that stretched far beyond the confines of Wittenberg. But it wasn't just theologians, political theorists, social critics, satirists. Anyone with an axe to grind or a message to share could, if they found a willing and perhaps brave printer, unleash their words upon the world in pamphlet form. It was the 16th century equivalent of a viral blog post or a heated Twitter thread, capable of igniting public passion and challenging the established order. A key historical fact that demonstrates the scale of this early popular print is the sheer number of ephemeral items produced. While many haven't survived due to their flimsy nature and intended disposability, extant library collections and historical records show that printers were churning out these cheap sheets by the thousands, often in response to specific events or popular demand. The output far exceeded that of learned books in terms of sheer volume of individual items. Religious institutions, as we saw with indulgences, were quick to adopt this cheap print format. Besides indulgences, which were essentially printed certificates offering remission for sins, a spiritual get-out-of-jail-free card, for a price, churches also commissioned the printing of simple catechisms, prayer sheets, pilgrim badges often with a woodcut image of a saint and a short prayer, and notices for feast days or special services. These items help to standardize and disseminate religious practice at a very local, personal level. A quirky tidbit from this world of affordable sheets is the Einblattdruck, a German term for a single-leaf print, often heavily illustrated with a woodcut and accompanied by a short text. These could cover a huge range of subjects' moral allegories, depictions of saints, scenes from daily life, portrayals of exotic animals described by travelers, or even simple alphabets and primers for children. They were a form of visual and textual wallpaper for the early modern mind, providing images and snippets of information that would have been previously unavailable to most. You might see one pinned to the wall of a tavern or a craftsman's workshop, sparking conversation and perhaps a little wonder. Historians continue to debate the precise literacy levels required to engage with these materials. While full fluency was still uncommon, basic functional literacy, the ability to recognize a few key words, decipher a simple prayer, or get the gist of a heavily illustrated broadside, may have been more widespread than previously thought. Or perhaps these items were frequently consumed collectively, with one literate person reading aloud to a group. Regardless, the sheer, unprecedented availability of these affordable printed sheets began to subtly alter the information environment of daily life. The world was becoming, quite literally, more full of words and images than ever before. And this textual saturation was slowly, but surely, changing how ordinary people learned, what they talked about, and how they saw their place within a rapidly shifting society. The clanking presses are not only spewing forth sensational broadsides and religious tracts, they are also, in a less dramatic but equally profound way, beginning to impose a new kind of order on the very building blocks of communication words, grammar, and the visual presentation of knowledge. Before the advent of print, as you recall, the world of text was a wonderfully diverse but often frustratingly inconsistent landscape. A scribe in Normandy might spell a word differently from his counterpart in London, even if they were both writing in a form of French or English. Punctuation was idiosyncratic. Abbreviations were rife to save precious space on expensive parchment, and the physical layout of a manuscript page could vary enormously. Now, as you step into the world of the early printer, you witness the dawn of standardization, a gradual but relentless process that would reshape learning and language itself. Imagine you're an apprentice in an early printing house, perhaps in the bustling workshop of Aldus Manutius in Venice or William Caxton in Westminster. Your master printer, when preparing a text for publication, faces a constant stream of decisions that simply didn't arise in the same way for a lone scribe. If the manuscript copy he's working from has multiple spellings for the same word, which one does he choose for his typesetters? If the punctuation is ambiguous, how does he clarify it for the printed version? If the author's handwriting is particularly atrocious, a common complaint, how does he interpret those scrawls into clear, consistent letter forms? These weren't just aesthetic choices, they were practical necessities. To set type efficiently and produce a legible, or unquote, saleable product, a degree of uniformity was essential. And because every single copy that came off that press would be identical, the choices made by that one printer, for that one edition, would be multiplied hundreds or thousands of times, disseminating a particular set of linguistic conventions far more widely than any single manuscript ever could. This led to the development of house styles within different printing establishments. Printers, often in consultation with scholars or editors they employed, began to create their own internal rulebooks for spelling, capitalization, punctuation, and even preferred vocabulary. As certain printers became more successful and their books more widely circulated, their house styles would inevitably influence other printers, as well as authors and readers. A key historical fact is that William Caxton, who established the first printing press in England in 1476, played a significant role in shaping the development of the English language through the books he chose to print, and the dialect largely London-based he adopted. His printed editions of works like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur helped to fix certain spellings and grammatical forms in the nascent Standard English. He was, in a sense, a one-man language academy. making editorial decisions that would resonate for centuries. Right. Caxton might have said to his compositor, "We're going with night with a K and a jang. Looks more distinguished. And for heaven's sake, stop using that infernal Yorkshire spelling for church." This process of standardization wasn't always deliberate or driven by scholarly ideals. Sometimes it was purely pragmatic. Printers had a finite number of individual letter sorts in their typecases. If they ran out of a particular letter, they might substitute another or use an abbreviation. The physical constraints of fitting text onto a page or into a fixed-length line justification also influenced choices about word breaks, spacing, and abbreviations. But over time, the overall trend was towards greater regularity. The publication of dictionaries and grammar books, themselves made more widely available by print, further accelerated this process, providing authoritative references for writers, printers, and educators. The impact on education and learning was immense. Students across Europe could now, increasingly, study from identical editions of classical texts, scientific treatises, or religious commentaries. This facilitated a more uniform curriculum and allowed scholars to refer to specific passages with greater precision, aided by standardized page numbers and, eventually, line numbers. The errata slip, a little printed list of corrections inserted into a book, became a common feature, a quirky acknowledgement that even printers, for all their standardizing efforts, were human and made mistakes. Oops, looks like we printed "The Sune revolves around the Earth" on page 42 of the astronomy text. Best print up some correction slips before Copernicus sees this and has a fit. Furthermore, the visual standardization of the printed page with consistent fonts, regularized spacing, title pages, tables of contents, and indexes made text easier to read and navigate. This might seem like a small thing to us, accustomed as we are to such features. But for a 15th or 16th century reader encountering these new conventions, it would have made the act of engaging with a lengthy text far less daunting. Historians and linguists continue to explore the complex interplay between print and language development. Did print merely accelerate existing trends towards standardization in vernacular languages, or did it actively shape those trends in new directions? And to what extent did the choices of influential early printers inadvertently marginalize certain regional dialects or linguistic forms? It's an ongoing scholarly debate. What is clear is that the printing press, by its very nature as a technology of mass replication, acted as a powerful homogenizing force on the written word. It tidied up the beautiful, wild, and sometimes bewildering garden of manuscript culture, laying down more orderly rows and pathways that would, in turn, make it easier for more people to enter and explore the expanding world of learning. The quiet work of the typesetter, choosing one letter over another, was subtly recalibrating the language of daily life. The printing press, now firmly established in workshops across Europe, is doing more than just standardizing the look of words on a page or making religious texts more available. It's fundamentally altering the speed, reach, and even the nature of how news and information circulate, subtly weaving a more connected, if sometimes more agitated, tapestry of daily life. Before this clanking marvel, as you know, news was a slow, often unreliable traveler, dependent on the stamina of a messenger, the memory of a traveler, or the vocal cords of a town crier. Now, information, both official and unofficial, begins to take flight with an unprecedented velocity, flapping its inky wings into towns, villages, and even relatively isolated homesteads. Imagine yourself a resident of a bustling trading city like Nuremberg or Lyon in the early 16th century. Previously, news from distant lands, a war in Italy, a new trade route opened by the Portuguese. A theological dispute in Wittenberg would arrive sporadically, often weeks or months after the event, passed along by merchants, pilgrims, or official couriers. It would be filtered through multiple retellings, prone to exaggeration or minimization depending on who was doing the telling. It's like getting your international news from a series of increasingly unreliable storytellers around a campfire. Entertaining, perhaps, but not exactly a model of accuracy or timeliness. Now, enter the world of printed news sheets, relations, or Corantos. These were among the earliest precursors to modern newspapers. Typically single sheets or small pamphlets, they would report on specific events, often drawing their information from letters, official dispatches, or even eyewitness accounts of varying reliability. Of course, a printer might receive a packet of letters from a merchant in Venice detailing a recent naval battle with the Ottoman Turks. Within a day or two, he could have a printed account of this battle, complete with a dramatic and probably generic woodcut of ships clashing, ready for sale on the streets. Suddenly, people across a much wider geographical area could learn about this event with a degree of detail and immediacy that was previously impossible. A key historical fact is that by the early 17th century, more regular, albeit still often weekly or bi-weekly, printed news publications began to emerge in cities like Strasbourg, Amsterdam, and London, laying the groundwork for the modern newspaper. This acceleration in the flow of information had a profound impact on daily awareness. People were becoming more conscious of events happening beyond their immediate locality, more aware of themselves as part of a larger European or even global context, especially as news from the newly discovered Americas began to filter back. This didn't necessarily mean they were better informed in an objective sense. Early news printing was rife with propaganda, bias, and outright fabrication, but they were certainly more informed, or at least more bombarded with information. You might be enjoying your breakfast ale and suddenly find yourself reading about a peasant revolt in a distant German principality, or the latest theological pronouncement from Geneva. The world was, in a sense, shrinking, brought closer by these flying sheets of printed paper. Goodness me, Martha, a Londoner might exclaim to his wife. Did you see this Coranto from Amsterdam? Says the Spanish are up to no good in the Low Countries again. Pass the kippers. I need to digest this. Official bodies, as we've touched upon, also use this new speed to their advantage. Royal proclamations, declarations of war, new laws, tax levies, all could be printed and disseminated with an efficiency that was a bureaucrat's dream. This allowed for more centralized control and a more rapid response to events. If a plague outbreak was reported in a particular region, printed warnings and quarantine orders could be distributed much faster than by relying on mounted messengers alone. A quirky tidbit from this era is the poster. While we associate posters with more modern advertising, early printers quickly realized the power of a large, eye-catching printed sheet for public announcements. These could be anything from advertisements for a new book or a traveling theatrical troupe, to wanted posters for criminals or official notices of public auctions. These printed posters, nailed to walls and posts, became a new feature of the urban visual landscape, competing for attention in the bustling streets. Imagine trying to walk down a street in, say, 1550s Paris, and being assailed by printed notices about everything from the price of bread to the latest heretical sermon to be publicly burned. It's the beginning of information overload, 16th century style. Historians and communication scholars continue to explore the complex relationship between the rise of printed news and the formation of what Benedict Anderson famously called imagined communities. The sense of shared identity and belonging among people who might never meet but who consume the same information and feel part of the same larger group, like a nation. Did the widespread availability of news printed in the vernacular help to foster these nascent national identities by creating a shared information space? It's a compelling argument. Of course, this newfound speed and reach of information also had its downsides. Rumors and misinformation could spread just as quickly, if not more so, than accurate reports. Panics could be ignited, prejudices inflamed, and anxieties heightened by sensational or biased printed accounts. The printing press was a powerful amplifier, for good and for ill. But one thing was certain: the old, slow, localized information world was fading. Daily life was becoming increasingly intertwined with a stream of printed words and images arriving from further afield, at a faster pace than ever before. The quiet ripples of individual conversations were now being joined by the louder, more widespread currents of printed public discourse. The printing press, as you're beginning to see, isn't just an intellectual or political force, it's subtly rethreading the very fabric of everyday existence, right down to how people perceive and organize their passage through time. We touched earlier on how, before widespread print, your average medieval person's calendar was largely dictated by the sun, the seasons, and the church's liturgical cycle. It was a rhythm of life deeply embedded in natural and religious observances. But as printing presses begin to churn out affordable calendars and, even more importantly, richly detailed almanacs, a new, more standardized, and more universally accessible way of structuring daily, weekly, and yearly life starts to take hold, bringing a new kind of order and a new set of anxieties into the homes of ordinary people. Imagine you're a farmer in the English countryside or a shopkeeper in a small German town in the late 15th or early 16th century. You know the major feast days, of course: Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and your local priest keeps track of the saints' days and fast days. You know when to plant and when to harvest based on generations of local wisdom. But what about knowing the exact date for a distant market fair you heard about? Or when the next full moon is for planning a night journey? Or even more esoterically, which days are considered lucky or unlucky for certain undertakings? According to the stars. For this kind of detailed, predictable information, you would have previously been reliant on rare, expensive handwritten calendars, or more likely, on no precise guide at all. Now, picture a peddler arriving in your village, his pack filled with cheaply printed single-sheet calendars for the new year, or perhaps small, stitched almanacs. For a few pennies, you can acquire a tangible, portable guide to the year ahead. A key historical fact is that these printed calendars and almanacs were among the earliest bestsellers of the printing revolution, precisely because they served a very real, practical need for a wide range of people. Printers understood that if you wanted a product that would sell consistently, an annual calendar or almanac was a pretty safe bet. It was the 15th century equivalent of a yearly software update subscription. Guaranteed repeat business. These early printed calendars would typically list the months, the days of the week, the dates of major religious festivals, both fixed, like Christmas, and movable, like Easter, which required complex calculations to determine each year, and often the phases of the moon. Some might include simple woodcut illustrations appropriate to the seasons or major feasts. Having this information readily available in printed form helped to synchronize activities across communities and even regions. If everyone is working from a similar printed calendar, there's less confusion about when a particular market day is, or when a rent payment is due to the local lord. It subtly imposed a more uniform temporal grid on daily life. Almanacs, however, went much further than simple calendars. They were true multimedia compendia of their time, packed with a bewildering array of information, designed to be both useful and entertaining. You'd find detailed astronomical and astrological information tables of sunrise and sunset. Predictions for eclipses often a source of great public anxiety. The movements of the planets through the signs of the zodiac, and, crucially, astrological forecasts for individuals, for agriculture, and for political events. For many people in this period, astrology was not a fringe belief but a serious science, deeply intertwined with medicine, farming, and personal decision-making. Your printed almanac might tell you which days were auspicious for bloodletting, a common medical procedure, for planting beans, for starting a journey, or even for cutting your hair. You might muse, flipping through your almanac. Saturn is in a grumpy conjunction with Mars today. Best not to ask the wife about buying that new pig. I reckon. Tomorrow looks better, especially if I wear green. Beyond astrology, almanacs often contained weather prognostications notoriously unreliable, but eagerly consulted, agricultural advice, tide tables for coastal areas, lists of weights and measures, distances between towns, rudimentary historical chronologies, moral proverbs, riddles, and even simple medical remedies. They were the Swiss Army knife of printed matter for the ordinary household. A quirky tidbit some almanacs included a feature called the Anatomy Man or Zodiac Man, a diagram of a human body showing which parts were supposedly governed by which signs of the zodiac. This was used for astrological medicine, indicating, for example, that you shouldn't bleed a patient from the arm if the moon was in Gemini, which ruled the arms. It seems a bit random to us, but it was taken very seriously. Historians often debate the actual influence of the astrological and prognostic content of these almanacs on people's daily decision-making. Did people genuinely live their lives according to these printed forecasts, or was it more a form of entertainment and general guidance? Taken with a pinch of salt, it likely varied greatly. But the sheer ubiquity of printed almanacs, they were often the only book in a household apart from perhaps a prayer book or a Bible, suggests they played a significant role in shaping the popular understanding of time, nature, and the cosmos. They provided a framework, however scientifically dubious at times, for making sense of the world and planning one's activities within it. The rhythms of daily life were still profoundly tied to the natural world and the church year. But now, those rhythms were being interpreted, predicted, and structured by the ink on a printed page, held in the hands of increasingly time-conscious individuals. As the printing press continues its steady, clanking work across Europe, churning out calendars that organize time and broadsides that spread news, it's also becoming an incredibly potent force in an arena that touches nearly every aspect of medieval and early modern daily life religion. We've already alluded to how the Reformation was fueled by print, but it's worth delving deeper into how this new technology specifically reshaped personal piety, communal worship, and the very authority structures of the Christian faith, making the Word of God and debates about it more accessible and more contentious than ever before. Before the age of print, your experience of Christianity, if you were an ordinary layperson in Western Europe, was largely mediated through the institution of the church and its ordained clergy. You attended Mass, conducted in Latin, a language few understood. You listened to sermons, often the primary source of religious instruction. You confessed your sins to a priest. You venerated saints, whose stories you knew from images, plays, and oral tradition. Your access to the Bible itself was extremely limited, almost non-existent. The scriptures were in Latin, and handwritten copies were rare, immensely expensive, and usually kept within monastic or cathedral libraries. Your faith was built on communal ritual, clerical authority, and a visual and oral culture. It's like trying to understand a complex legal document armed only with a few evocative pictures and someone else's verbal summary. You're getting a version, but not necessarily the whole, unmediated text. Then comes the printing press, and with it, a seismic shift. Johannes Gutenberg's first major work, the Latin Bible, though initially a luxury item, signaled the potential soon. Printers across Europe were producing not only more Latin Bibles, but also, crucially, translations of the scriptures into vernacular languages: German, English, French, Italian. A key historical fact is the profound impact of Martin Luther's German New Testament of 1592 and his complete German Bible of 1534. These and similar vernacular translations by figures like William Tyndale in English were printed in vast quantities and disseminated widely. For the first time in centuries, literate laypeople could, in theory, read the foundational texts of their faith in their own tongue, in their own homes. This was an act of profound empowerment and a direct challenge to the Church's traditional role as the sole interpreter of Scripture. Wait a minute, a German shoemaker might exclaim, puzzling over his newly acquired printed New Testament. This bit about salvation through faith alone? Pastor Johann never mentioned that. The printing press became the Reformation's most powerful engine. Reformers like Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and others used printed pamphlets, sermons, theological treatises, and catechisms to spread their ideas with astonishing speed and reach. They could bypass the established church hierarchy and appeal directly to the populace. Arguments that might have once been confined to scholarly debates within university faculties now became matters of public discussion and passionate conviction in marketplaces, taverns, and private homes. The 95 Theses. Famously, though perhaps apocryphally nailed to a church door by Luther in 1517, achieved their widespread impact because they were quickly translated, printed, and distributed throughout Germany and beyond. This flood of printed religious material flooded both Protestant and in response. Catholic Counter-Reformation literature had a deep effect on daily religious life. It encouraged a more personal, text-centered piety. People could own printed prayer books, books of hours simplified for lay use, or collections of sermons. Family Bible reading, where feasible, became a cornerstone of devotion in many Protestant households. Even for the illiterate, the existence of these vernacular texts was transformative. They could be read aloud, memorized, and discussed within families and communities. The very words of Scripture, or at least of religious argument, were in the air, more accessible than ever. A quirky tidbit from this era is the proliferation of printed religious woodcuts and broadsides, often with a strong polemical or satirical bent. You might see a Protestant woodcut depicting the Pope as the whore of Babylon, or a Catholic one showing Luther consorting with demons. These images were potent propaganda, easily understood even by those who couldn't read the accompanying text, and they played a significant role in shaping popular perceptions and fueling religious passions, sometimes with tragic and violent consequences. The press wasn't just printing words of peace, it was also printing declarations of spiritual war. Historians still debate the complex relationship between print, literacy, and religious change. Did the availability of printed vernacular scriptures directly cause a massive surge in literacy? Or did it primarily empower those who were already literate or becoming so for other reasons like commerce? And to what extent did printed materials genuinely reflect or shape the religious beliefs of the common person, as opposed to the educated elites who produced and consumed most of them? It was undoubtedly a dynamic interplay. The press didn't invent religious dissent, but it provided it with an unprecedented megaphone. It allowed for the creation of new religious communities based on shared interpretations of printed texts, and it permanently altered the religious landscape of Europe, making faith a more personal, more textually grounded, and often more fiercely contested aspect of daily existence for millions. The quiet act of reading a printed page could now have eternal and very worldly consequences. The printing presses are now humming across Europe, scattering an ever-increasing variety of texts, from Bibles in the common tongue and fiery Reformation pamphlets to practical almanacs and sensational news sheets, into the towns and villages. You've seen how this availability of printed matter is starting to reshape religious devotion, business practices, and even the perception of time and news. But all these changes hinge on a fundamental skill that, for most of medieval society, was as rare as a unicorn citing the ability to read. Now, as you stand at this juncture where printed words are becoming more common, you witness the slow, often uneven, but ultimately transformative flowering of literacy. A reader's dawn that will gradually illuminate the daily lives of more and more people. Before print, as we've firmly established, literacy was a highly restricted skill, largely the domain of the clergy, the aristocracy, and a small cadre of professional scribes and merchants. For the vast majority, the peasants, the urban laborers, the artisans, the world was primarily an oral and visual one. Knowledge was passed down through speech, song, and story. Instructions were given verbally. Agreements were often sealed with a handshake or a symbolic gesture rather than a written contract. The need for personal literacy in their daily grind was minimal. Why learn to decipher complex symbols on expensive parchment when your life revolved around the plow, the loom, or the forge, and the village priest or town crier told you everything you needed to know from officialdom or the church? It's like trying to convince someone who only ever walks to buy a car. The perceived utility just isn't there for many. The arrival of the printing press didn't instantly flip a switch and make everyone a fluent reader. The growth of literacy was a much more gradual and complex phenomenon, influenced by a confluence of factors. However, the sheer, unprecedented availability of printed material was a crucial catalyst. Suddenly, there was simply more to read, and it was becoming significantly cheaper. A single printed sheet, like a ballad or a woodcut with a caption, might cost only a tiny fraction of what even the smallest, simplest handwritten prayer scroll would have. This created both an opportunity and, increasingly, an incentive to learn. If a neighbor has a printed almanac that seems to predict the weather however accurately, or a pamphlet that explains a new and exciting or terrifying religious idea, a certain curiosity, a desire to access that information directly, might begin to stir. A key historical fact underscoring this shift is the changing nature of education. While formal schooling remained limited for many, the Reformation, as we've seen, provided a powerful religious impetus for literacy in many Protestant territories. The belief that individuals should be able to read the Bible for themselves led to the establishment of new schools and an emphasis on teaching basic reading skills, often in the vernacular. In Catholic areas, too, the Counter-Reformation recognized the power of print for catechesis and devotional purposes, leading to an increased production of approved religious texts and, in some cases, efforts to improve lay literacy to counter Protestant arguments. Education, whether for religious or increasingly secular purposes like commerce, was slowly beginning to incorporate the printed word as a fundamental tool. Your village schoolmaster, if you were lucky enough to have one, might now have access to a few printed primers or basic readers, a significant upgrade from relying solely on recitation and a single, precious handwritten example. The expanding world of trade and urban craftsmanship also played a role. As printed business forms, account books, technical manuals, and guild regulations became more common, a degree of functional literacy became an increasingly valuable asset for those involved in commerce or skilled trades. An apprentice who could read instructions or a merchant who could decipher a printed price list from a distant market had a distinct advantage. It's like today, knowing how to use a computer is no longer a niche skill. It's a basic requirement for many jobs. Literacy was slowly becoming that kind of foundational skill in the early modern world. A quirky tidbit that offers a glimpse into the early stages of reading acquisition is the horn book. This was a common teaching aid from the 15th century well into the 19th. It typically consisted of a single sheet of paper, printed with the alphabet, numerals, perhaps a simple prayer like the Lord's Prayer, mounted on a wooden paddle and protected by a thin, translucent sheet of animal horn, hence the name or mica. It was a child's first book, durable and cheap, designed to introduce them to the rudiments of reading. Many an early modern child would have squinted at one of these, laboriously sounding out their ABCs. A is for apple, B is for bishop, C is for cholera. Oh, wait, that's from that other scary broadside. However, it's crucial to avoid romanticizing this reader's dawn. Progress was slow and uneven. Literacy rates varied dramatically by region, social class, and gender. Rural areas generally lagged far behind urban centers. The poor had far fewer opportunities for education than the wealthy, and women, across all classes, were often excluded from formal schooling, though many learned to read in domestic settings or through religious instruction, particularly for devotional purposes. Even for those who did learn to read, fluency and comprehension levels would have varied enormously. Being able to slowly decipher a simple prayer was very different from being able to engage with a complex theological treatise or a lengthy historical chronicle. Historians still engage in extensive scholarly debate about how to measure historical literacy rates accurately. Given the patchiness of sources and the differing definitions of what literacy even meant, was signing one's name with a mark evidence of illiteracy? Or could such individuals still possess some rudimentary reading ability? It's a complex puzzle. What is undeniable is that the printing press, by vastly increasing the sheer volume of textual material in circulation and lowering its cost, created an environment where the acquisition of reading skills became more possible, more desirable, and gradually more widespread. The world was slowly, painstakingly, learning to read itself. One printed page, one hornbook, one laboriously deciphered word at a time. The clatter of the printing press, as we're seeing, is echoing far beyond the scriptoria of monasteries and the studies of theologians. It's now finding its way into the bustling counting houses of merchants, the guild halls of artisans, and even the dusty offices of petty bureaucrats. While the grand narratives of religious reform and intellectual renaissance often take center stage, you need to appreciate how this new technology was also quietly, yet profoundly, revolutionizing the mundane but essential machinery of daily commerce, contract law, and administration. It's not as sexy as a theological showdown, perhaps, but the ability to print standardized forms, ledgers, price lists, and official notices was greasing the wheels of an increasingly complex late medieval and early modern economy. Imagine you're a wool merchant in Bruges or a banker in Florence in the latter half of the 15th century. Your business relies on accurate record keeping, clear contracts, and timely communication with your partners and clients, who might be hundreds of miles away. Before the widespread use of printed commercial documents, every bill of exchange, every loan agreement, every inventory list, every letter of credit had to be meticulously handwritten by a clerk or scribe. This was not only incredibly time-consuming and therefore expensive, but also prone to human error. A misplaced decimal point, if they were even using Arabic numerals consistently yet, a vaguely worded clause or an illegible signature could lead to significant financial loss or protracted legal disputes. It's like trying to run a multinational corporation using only post-it notes and a very tired intern with a quill. Now, enter the local printer, who quickly realizes there's a lucrative market beyond Bibles and ballads. He can produce stacks of pre-printed forms for all sorts of commercial transactions, blank contracts with standardized clauses, just needing names, dates, and amounts to be filled in, bills of lading for shipping goods, standardized account book pages with neat columns and headings, making bookkeeping more orderly and less of a creative writing exercise. A key historical fact is that some of the earliest surviving examples of ephemeral jobbing printing are precisely these kinds of commercial forms. Printers in Venice, a major hub of international trade, were among the first to capitalize on this demand, producing items like maritime insurance forms. This simple innovation, the pre-printed form, saved businesses immense amounts of time and effort, reduced errors, and brought a new level of consistency and professionalism to commercial paperwork. Your overworked clerk might actually get home before midnight now, a truly revolutionary development in itself. This had a ripple effect on daily business practices. With standardized printed contracts, it became easier and arguably safer to do business with people you didn't know personally, or who were geographically distant. The terms were clearly laid out, less open to individual misinterpretation or a scribe's idiosyncratic phrasing. This helped to facilitate the growth of longer-distance trade and more complex financial instruments. The rise of printed price currents, lists showing the prevailing market prices for various commodities in different trading centers, also allowed merchants to make more informed decisions. Fostering more efficient and integrated markets, you could now have a printed sheet telling you the price of pepper in Alexandria versus Antwerp, which was a significant upgrade from relying on your cousin's third-hand report from 6 months ago. Blast, a merchant might exclaim. I just bought a shipload of nutmeg, and this new printed price sheet from Venice says the bottom has fallen out of the market. Should have invested in printed horoscopes instead. Bureaucracies, both civic and royal, were also enthusiastic adopters of printed forms. Tax collection, legal summonses, official licenses, guild memberships, census records. All these administrative processes could be streamlined and standardized through the use of printed documents. This didn't necessarily make bureaucracy less annoying for the average person. Filling out Form 37B in triplicate is probably no more fun in the 16th century than it is today. But it made the machinery of governance operate with a new, if sometimes soulless, efficiency. The ability to quickly print and distribute official notices and regulations also enhanced the reach and authority of governing bodies. A quirky tidbit from this era of printed administration is the use of printed letters of indulgence, not just by the church, but sometimes by secular authorities for fundraising purposes, perhaps to build a bridge or repair town walls. For a contribution, you might get a nicely printed certificate offering some minor civic privilege, or more vaguely, goodwill. It was an early form of crowdfunding with a printed receipt. Of course, the transition wasn't instantaneous or universal. For many small-scale artisans or local shopkeepers, handwritten ledgers and informal agreements remained the norm for a long time. And the proliferation of printed forms didn't eliminate fraud or disputes. It just changed their nature. Forging a printed document might require different skills than altering a manuscript, but human ingenuity in such matters is, alas, perennial. Historians still explore the complex impact of these printed commercial and administrative instruments on economic development and state formation. Did the standardization and efficiency they brought significantly accelerate capitalist development and the growth of centralized states? Or were they more a symptom of these broader changes already underway? It's likely a case of mutual reinforcement. What is clear is that the printing press provided the practical tools that enabled increasingly complex economic and administrative systems to function more effectively. The daily hum of commerce, the meticulous recording of debts and credits, the official pronouncements of mayors and kings, all were increasingly underpinned by the quiet, consistent, and multiplying power of black ink on printed paper. The business of everyday life was getting a significant, if sometimes overlooked, upgrade. While printed business forms are making the lives of merchants a tad easier and pamphlets are stirring up public debate, the printing press is also working its magic on something that will literally expand the known world for many Europeans. The map. Before the mid-15th century, as you can imagine, maps were rare, precious, and often wildly inaccurate by our standards. They were typically hand-drawn on expensive vellum, often unique creations commissioned by wealthy patrons, rulers, or religious institutions. For your average medieval individual, their mental map of the world probably extended not much further than the next village, with anything beyond that fading into a vague realm of rumor, legend, and perhaps a bit of "here be dragons" anxiety. But as the printing press gets its gears whirring, these cartographic treasures begin a slow journey from locked libraries into a wider, if still primarily elite, circulation, profoundly impacting how people understood their place on the planet and how they dared to venture across it. The earliest printed maps, appearing in the latter half of the 15th century, were often woodcuts. This technique, while capable of producing multiple copies, had limitations in terms of detail and accuracy. Carving intricate coastlines or fine lettering onto a wooden block was a painstaking process, and the blocks themselves could wear down or warp with repeated use. A key historical fact is that one of the first major geographical works to be printed with maps was an edition of Ptolemy's Geographia. This ancient Greek text, rediscovered and translated into Latin in the early 15th century, provided a mathematical framework for map-making and detailed coordinates for thousands of locations across the known world of antiquity. The first printed edition with maps based on Ptolemy's descriptions appeared in Bologna in 1477, followed by numerous others from presses in Rome, Florence, Ulm, and elsewhere. These Ptolemaic maps, while containing significant errors like underestimating the Earth's circumference and showing a landlocked Indian Ocean, were revolutionary because they provided a standardized, comprehensive, and mathematically based vision of the world, now reproducible and available to scholars across Europe. It was like everyone suddenly getting the same, albeit slightly flawed, user manual for planet Earth. As the age of discovery dawned, with explorers like Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Magellan venturing into uncharted waters and encountering new lands, the demand for more accurate and up-to-date maps exploded. The printing press was ready to meet this demand, though the transition from woodcut to more precise copperplate engraving for maps was crucial here. Copperplate engraving allowed for much finer lines, more detailed lettering, and greater accuracy in depicting coastlines and geographical features. Printers and cartographers, often working in major maritime centers like Venice, Antwerp, Lisbon, and Amsterdam, began to produce increasingly sophisticated maps and charts incorporating the latest information sent back by returning voyagers. You could, if you had the means, purchase a printed map showing the coast of Africa, the islands of the Caribbean, or even the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, geographical realities that would have been unimaginable to your grandparents. The world was literally being redrawn and printed before people's eyes. Good heavens, Bartholomew, one merchant might say to another, unfolding a new chart. It seems this America place is rather larger than we initially thought. And look, no sign of those men with heads in their chests that old Marco Polo went on about. This wider availability of printed maps had a profound, if gradual, impact on daily life, particularly for those involved in trade, navigation, and governance. Sailors and pilots, while still relying heavily on their practical experience and traditional portal and charts, increasingly had access to printed sea charts that offered a more standardized and widely shared view of coastlines, hazards, and routes. This didn't eliminate the dangers of sea travel, but it provided an additional tool, fostering a more systematic approach to navigation. Merchants could use printed maps to better understand trade routes, the location of resources, and the territories of their commercial rivals and partners. Rulers and administrators used maps for strategic planning, for defining borders, and for understanding the extent of their domains and those they wished to acquire. A quirky tidbit: some early printed maps, in an effort to fill the vast unknown spaces, particularly in the interiors of newly discovered continents, would still be decorated with fanciful images of mythical creatures, exotic and often entirely imaginary flora and fauna, or depictions of cannibal kings and fabled cities of gold. It was a blend of emerging scientific cartography and lingering medieval wonder. The mapmakers were hedging their bets. Mostly accurate coastline, but let's keep that unicorn in Patagonia, just in case. Of course, access to these printed maps was still largely confined to the wealthy, the educated, and those in specialized professions. Your average peasant wasn't likely to own a hand-colored copperplate engraving of Mercator's latest world projection. However, the ideas and images from these maps began to filter down through society via cheaper printed materials, illustrations in books, and general conversation. The very concept of the world as a sphere, with distinct continents and oceans, became more concrete and widely understood. Historians still debate the precise role of printed maps in stimulating the age of exploration itself. Did the availability of increasingly accurate maps encourage more voyages? Or did the voyages primarily drive the production of new maps? It was undoubtedly a feedback loop, with each fueling the other. What is certain is that the printing press became the indispensable medium for recording, reproducing, and disseminating the rapidly expanding geographical knowledge of the era. It helped to create a shared, evolving visual understanding of the globe, moving cartography from a rare artisanal craft to a more systematic, scientifically informed, and commercially viable enterprise. The world, once a place of localized horizons and vague, distant wonders, was slowly being charted, printed, and brought into a sharper, if still incomplete, focus for everyday people. The printing press, as it clanks and rattles its way through European society, isn't just transforming the world of words and images, it's also starting to change the very soundscape of daily life, particularly for those with a musical inclination. Before the advent of printed music, if you wanted to perform a piece of polyphony music with multiple independent melodic lines or learn a complex instrumental tune, your options were limited and often laborious. You might learn it by ear, a slow process prone to inaccuracies, especially for intricate compositions. Or if you were part of a wealthy cathedral choir, a royal court, or a particularly cultured monastic order, you might have access to precious hand-copied musical manuscripts. These were like their textual counterparts, expensive, rare, and often jealously guarded. But now, as printers begin to master the fiendishly complex art of typesetting musical notation, the notes themselves begin to flow more freely, promising to make shared melodies and harmonies a more accessible part of everyday artistic and social life. Imagine yourself as an amateur musician in a prosperous Italian or German city in the early 16th century. Perhaps you play the lute, the viol, or you enjoy singing madrigals with a group of friends. Acquiring new music would have been a constant endeavor. You might try to copy down a tune you heard, or persuade a professional musician to write out a part for you. But the idea of readily available, accurate scores for a wide variety of music was largely a dream. It's like wanting to learn all the latest hit songs today, but having to rely on someone humming them to you over a crackly phone line. The technical challenges of printing music were, as we've touched upon, arguably even greater than those of printing straightforward text. Musical notation involves a complex interplay of horizontal staves, notes of varying shapes indicating pitch and duration, clefs, accidentals, rests, and often accompanying lyrics. Getting all these elements aligned correctly and legibly using movable type was a true typographical nightmare. Early attempts were often cumbersome, sometimes requiring multiple impressions on the same sheet of paper, one for the staves, another for the notes, and perhaps a third for the text. A key historical fact is that Ottaviano Petrucci, a printer working in Venice, is widely celebrated as the pioneer of successfully printing polyphonic music using a triple impression technique with movable type. His publication in 1501 of the Harmonies Musiques Ottocraten a collection of secular French chansons, was a landmark achievement. It demonstrated that complex, multi-part music could be printed with elegance and accuracy, and it opened the floodgates for music publishing across Europe. Petrucci effectively became the first major music publisher, and in Venice, a hub of printing and culture, became an early center for this new industry. He probably had a few choice words for his typesetters when they mixed up their brevs and semi-brevs. Do you want us to sound like a chorus of confused geese align those minims people? The impact of printed music on daily musical life was, like many of print's effects, gradual but profound. For professional musicians, such as those in church choirs or court ensembles, printed choir books and part books meant access to a greatly expanded repertoire. It also led to greater standardization of musical pieces. A motet by Josquin des Prez, once printed, could be performed with a high degree of fidelity by choirs in different cities, even different countries, all working from the same score. This facilitated the spread of particular musical styles, like the Franco-Flemish polyphony that dominated European art music in the Renaissance. For amateur musicians, particularly among the burgeoning urban middle and upper classes, printed music opened up new possibilities for domestic and social music making. Collections of lute songs, madrigals, keyboard pieces, and dance tunes began to appear in print, often in formats designed for group performance. You could purchase a set of part books for madrigals, gather your literate musically and textually friends, and spend an evening sight-reading your way through the latest Italian hits. This fostered a more active, participatory musical culture among laypeople. A quirky tidbit, some of these printed music books were designed with a table book format, where the different voice parts were printed on the same opening, but oriented in different directions, so that singers or instrumentalists sitting around a table could all read their part from the single shared volume. It's a charming image of communal, domestic harmony, literally. Right, tenors, you're looking at the upside-down bit on the left. Try not to get a crick in your neck. And no spilling ale on the Petrucci edition. It cost a fortune. The printing of music also had implications for musical education. While personal instruction remained paramount, printed theoretical treatises on music, and rudimentary instruction books or tutors for various instruments began to appear. These made the basic principles of music theory and instrumental technique accessible to a wider audience, beyond those who could afford a private master. Historians of music and printing continue to debate the precise ways in which the medium of print might have influenced musical composition itself. Did the need to fit complex notation onto a printed page encourage certain types of musical textures or forms? Did the possibility of wider dissemination encourage composers to think of their works as more fixed, authored entities rather than fluid pieces subject to oral variation? It's likely that print did contribute to the growing prestige of the composer and the concept of the definitive musical work. The sound of music in daily life was slowly changing. While folk songs and orally transmitted tunes remained vibrant, the structured harmonies and composed melodies of art music were now, thanks to the press, able to travel further, be preserved more accurately, and be enjoyed by a gradually expanding circle of performers and listeners. The ephemeral art of music was finding a new, more permanent, and more widely shareable form on the printed page. The printing press, as we're discovering, is an engine of many talents, churning out not just the sacred and the scholarly, nor solely the commercial and the cartographic, but also venturing boldly into the often murky and anxious realm of human health. As you navigate the daily life of late medieval or early Renaissance Europe, the fear of illness, injury, and premature death is a constant companion. Medical knowledge, before print, was a complex tapestry woven from ancient Greek and Roman authorities like Hippocrates and Galen, whose texts were often filtered through centuries of handwritten, sometimes corrupted, copies, local folk wisdom, herbal remedies passed down through generations, and a hefty dose of religious belief and magical thinking. Now, with the advent of printing, both the venerable texts of learned medicine and a veritable flood of popular health guides, often of wildly varying quality, begin to pour forth, offering new avenues for understanding the body, treating ailments, and, just as often, peddling dubious cures to a vulnerable populace. Imagine you're feeling a bit under the weather in, say, Strasbourg or Padua in the early 16th century. Perhaps a lingering cough, a troubling skin condition, or the dreaded sweating sickness that periodically swept through communities. Your first port of call might be a local apothecary, a barber surgeon who, as the name suggests, might pull your tooth one day and let your blood the next. Or perhaps a university-trained physician if you are of sufficient means and reside in a city with a medical faculty. These practitioners would draw on their own training, which, for physicians, was heavily based on the classical texts, now increasingly available in printed editions thanks to the efforts of scholar printers. A key historical fact is the monumental impact of printed anatomical texts. Most famously, Andreas Vesalius's De Humani Corporis Fabrica on the fabric of the human body, published in 1543. Its detailed, realistic illustrations of human anatomy, based on Vesalius's own dissections and made reproducible through high-quality woodcuts, revolutionized the study of the body and challenged many of Galen's long-held anatomical errors. Suddenly, medical students across Europe could, in theory, all be looking at the same, relatively accurate, picture of a human liver or a femur, a massive leap forward for medical education. It's like going from a child's vague drawing of a skeleton to a detailed MRI scan in terms of visual information. However, this dissemination of scholarly medical knowledge was just one side of the coin. The printing press, being an indiscriminate amplifier, also gave rise to an explosion of popular medical literature aimed at a much broader, often less critical, audience. Cheaply printed herbals, for instance, became incredibly popular. These books would list various plants, often accompanied by woodcut illustrations of varying accuracy. Sometimes one generic plant picture served for a dozen different herbs, and described their supposed medicinal virtues. While some of this was based on sound traditional knowledge, much of it was intertwined with folklore, astrology. Remember those zodiac men in almanacs telling you which herbs worked best under which celestial influences? and the doctrine of signatures. The belief that a plant's appearance hinted at its medicinal use, ja, a heart-shaped leaf for heart ailments. You might find a printed herbal advising you that lungwort, because its leaves vaguely resembled a lung, was excellent for coughs. My dear, a concerned neighbor might say, waving a freshly printed page. This new German herbal says boiled nettles are just the thing for your egg, especially if consumed while standing on one leg facing east. It's right here in print, so it must be true. Then there were the myriad pamphlets and broadsides offering cures for specific ailments, often peddled by itinerant doctors or quacks who were quick to harness the authority of the printed word to lend credence to their often useless and sometimes dangerous remedies. You might see a printed handbill promising a miraculous elixir that cures everything from gout to lovesickness, or a secret recipe of the ancient Egyptians for eternal youth, probably involving some rather unsavory ingredients and a hefty price. The printing press made it easier than ever for medical misinformation and charlatanism to spread alongside genuine knowledge. It was the 16th century equivalent of those dodgy online ads promising to cure baldness with a single mysterious berry. A quirky tidbit that highlights this blend of medicine, print, and popular belief is the printing of bills of mortality in cities like London, especially during plague outbreaks. These were printed weekly sheets listing the number of deaths and often their supposed causes. While an early form of public health data collection, the causes of death were often diagnosed by lay searchers with no medical training and could be rather imaginative, like fright or teeth or rising of the lights, a vague term for lung issues. These printed bills, posted publicly, both informed and terrified the populace. Historians of medicine often debate the overall impact of this sudden flood of printed medical material on the actual health of the population. Did it empower individuals by giving them more access to information? Or did it mostly just create more confusion and anxiety and provide a wider platform for quackery? It was almost certainly a double-edged sword. The availability of printed texts did encourage some lay people to become more engaged with matters of health and to seek out different forms of treatment. It also facilitated the relatively rapid spread of new medical ideas, both good and bad, among practitioners themselves. However, for the average person trying to navigate this new, complex landscape of printed medical advice, often without the benefit of widespread literacy or scientific understanding, it could be a perilous journey. The daily struggle against illness was now accompanied by a rustling chorus of printed voices, some offering genuine wisdom, others peddling false hope, all bound together by the indiscriminate power of the press. The printing press, as you're now well aware, is doing far more than just producing Bibles for churches or maps for explorers. It's becoming a dynamic, and often disruptive, force in the very way societies talk to themselves and about their rulers. We've touched on how religious reformers used pamphlets to ignite widespread debate. Now, let's delve a little deeper into how this relatively new technology began to foster a broader sphere of public opinion and political discourse, allowing more voices and more varied arguments to circulate in the daily life of late medieval and early modern Europe than ever before. It's the birth of a new kind of public square, one built not of cobblestones but of cheap printed paper. Imagine yourself in a city like Paris, London, or Augsburg in the 16th or 17th century. The political and social air is often thick with tension, wars, religious strife, economic hardship, disputes between monarchs and their nobles or increasingly assertive urban populations. Before the widespread availability of print, public discussion of these matters was largely confined to sermons which could sometimes carry coded political messages, marketplace gossip, university disputations for the scholarly elite, or perhaps petitions and grievances presented directly, and often riskily, to authorities. The ability for a common person, or even a dissenting noble or cleric, to broadcast their views on matters of state to a wide audience was severely limited. It was hard to start a viral hashtag with just a quill and a very loud voice. The printing press changes this equation dramatically. Suddenly, An individual with a strong opinion and access to a printer who was willing to take the risk could produce hundreds, even thousands of copies of a pamphlet, a broadside, or a satirical poem, laying out their arguments, criticizing government policy, or lampooning powerful figures. These printed materials could then be sold cheaply on street corners, distributed through networks of like-minded individuals, or even smuggled across borders if they were particularly controversial. This created an unprecedented opportunity for ideas to circulate beyond the immediate control of church or state, fostering what we might recognize as the nascent stages of public opinion. You might be a weaver in Lyon, but by reading or having read to you a pamphlet printed in Geneva, you could engage with political or religious arguments originating far from your own city walls. This creates a sense of shared concern, a common ground for debate, that transcends local boundaries. Did you see that scandalous pamphlet about the king's new tax on beards? One citizen might whisper to another, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Old Master Gutenberg really opened a can of worms with this printing contraption, didn't he? A key historical fact is the explosion of pamphlet literature during periods of intense political crisis. The French Wars of Religion in the late 16th century, for example, saw a deluge of printed propaganda from both Catholic and Huguenot Protestant factions, each seeking to win hearts and minds and vilify their opponents. Similarly, the English Civil War in the mid-17th century was accompanied by a veritable blizzard of printed news books, political tracts, sermons, and satirical verses, as royalists and parliamentarians battled for public support not just on the battlefield, but also on the printed page. This paper lights, as it was sometimes called, was a crucial dimension of these conflicts. This new public discourse wasn't always edifying or enlightening. Much like online comment sections today, the world of early modern pamphleteering could be incredibly vitriolic, personal, and prone to misinformation and character assassination. Anonymity, or the use of pseudonyms, was common, allowing authors to express views they wouldn't dare voice openly. But amidst the slander and the screeching, genuine political and social critique could also find expression. Ideas about liberty, justice, the rights of subjects, the limits of royal power, and the nature of good governance began to be debated in print, reaching an audience far beyond the tiny circle of courtly advisors or university scholars. A quirky tidbit printers themselves sometimes became significant figures in these emerging public debates, not just as neutral technicians, but as active participants, choosing which text to publish a risky decision in itself, and sometimes adding their own prefaces or commentary. Some printers specialized in controversial or underground material, operating on the fringes of legality, their workshops becoming clandestine hubs for dissenting thought. They were the rogue sysops of their day, running the server that hosted the forbidden files. The authorities, of course, viewed this uncontrolled proliferation of printed opinion with considerable alarm. As we've noted, censorship laws, licensing systems for printers, and the prosecution of authors and publishers of seditious or heretical materials became increasingly common across Europe. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum list of prohibited books, first issued by the Pope in 1559, was a prime example of the Church's attempt to control the flow of dangerous printed ideas. But completely suppressing the tide of print was proving to be an impossible task. For every book banned, for every printer shut down, it seemed two more would spring up, often in more tolerant neighboring states, ready to supply the demand for controversial texts. Historians continue to debate the actual impact of this early printed public discourse on political outcomes and the daily lives of ordinary people. How many people actually read these pamphlets? And how deeply did they influence their actions or allegiances? Especially given still limited literacy, it's clear, however, that the printing press fundamentally altered the ecosystem of information and opinion. It created a new, dynamic, and often unruly space for public conversation, a space where the voices of individuals could, for the first time, resonate far beyond their immediate physical presence. The daily grumbles and discussions of the marketplace were now being amplified, codified, and scattered across the land on countless inky wings, slowly shaping a world where public opinion was becoming a force to be reckoned with. As the rhythmic clank and whir of the printing press becomes an increasingly familiar sound in European towns and cities, producing an ever-expanding river of books, pamphlets, broadsides, and forms. You can't help but wonder about the fate of those who, for centuries, had been the sole guardians and propagators of the written word, the scribes. Their world, one of quiet scriptoria, painstakingly prepared parchment, carefully mixed inks, and the slow, meticulous craft of forming each letter by hand, was facing an existential challenge from this new, ruthlessly efficient technology. The rise of print, while heralding a new age of information, also cast a long, poignant shadow over the ancient and honorable profession of the scribe, leading to what might be called the scribe's lament. Imagine you were a highly skilled scribe in Paris, Bruges, or Rome in the late 15th or early 16th century. Your entire life, your training, your livelihood, and perhaps a deep sense of personal and cultural identity are bound up in the art of beautiful handwriting, calligraphy, and the accurate transcription of texts. You take pride in the evenness of your script, the elegance of your letter forms, the quality of the materials you use. You are part of a tradition stretching back to antiquity, a vital link in the chain of knowledge preservation. Your patrons are wealthy nobles, high-ranking clergy, universities, or prosperous merchants who commission you to produce bespoke, often sumptuously illuminated, manuscripts, books of hours, legal documents, classical texts, or copies of important family records. It's a demanding craft, requiring immense patience, excellent eyesight, and a steady hand. It's like being a master artisan, a creator of unique, handcrafted textual treasures. Then, news of Gutenberg's invention and the subsequent rapid spread of printing presses begins to filter into your world. At first, perhaps, you and your fellow scribes might view this ars artificialiter scribendi, the art of writing artificially with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Surely these crude, mechanically produced texts, often printed on that new, flimsy material called paper rather than durable parchment, could never match the aesthetic quality, the gravitas, or the sheer bespoke luxury of a meticulously handwritten and illuminated manuscript. And indeed, for a time, the very wealthy continued to commission deluxe manuscripts as status symbols, sometimes even preferring them over printed books, or having printed books elaborately hand-finished by illuminators and rubricators to mimic the look of a manuscript. It's similar to how, even today, some people prefer a handwritten letter over an email for special occasions. There's a personal touch, a sense of artistry, that mass production can't easily replicate. However, for the vast bulk of textual needs, university textbooks, legal boilerplate, religious service books, commercial records, popular devotional works, and the burgeoning market for vernacular literature, the advantages of print in terms of speed, cost, and quantity were simply overwhelming. A printer could produce hundreds of identical copies of a text in the time it took a single scribe to produce one. The cost per copy plummeted. A key historical fact, it's estimated that by the year 1500, barely half a century after Gutenberg's Bible, as many as 20 million printed items in Cannabula, or books printed before 1501, had been produced in Europe. This sheer volume effectively swamped the manuscript market for most types of texts. The scribal profession, which had been the primary engine of textual reproduction for over a millennium, found itself facing obsolescence for its core function. Your highly specialized skill set was suddenly being devalued by a machine. A seasoned scribe might mutter, examining a somewhat smudgy early printed page. No soul in it, and look at that uneven inking call that a B. My apprentice could do better with his eyes closed and a hangover. The consequences for individual scribes varied. Some, particularly those with exceptional calligraphic or artistic talent, managed to adapt. They found work as illuminators or rubricators, adding hand-painted red letters or decorations for printed books. bridging the gap between the old and new technologies. Others, with their deep knowledge of texts and languages, transitioned into the burgeoning printing industry itself, becoming proofreaders, editors, typesetters, or even master printers. Their scribal training, with its emphasis on accuracy and textual fidelity, was still valuable in this new context. But for many rank-and-file scribes, whose main skill was straightforward copying, the decline in demand for their traditional services would have been economically devastating. They were, in a sense, the first victims of automation in the information industry. A quirky tidbit is the famous lament of Johannes Trithemius, the abbot of Sponheim, in his 1492 treatise De Laude Scriptorum in praise of scribes. While himself an owner of printed books and recognizing some of their utility, he passionately argued for the continued importance of manual transcription by monks, not just for preserving text, but for its spiritual and intellectual benefits to the scribe. He worried that the ease of printing would lead to intellectual laziness and a decline in true scholarship. His work is a poignant articulation of the anxieties felt by those who valued the old ways in the face of a disruptive new technology. Historians continue to investigate the social and economic impact on the scribal community. Was there widespread unemployment, forcing scribes into other professions or into poverty? Or was the transition more gradual, allowing many to find new niches or retire before the full impact was felt? The evidence is complex and varies by region and specialty. What is clear is that the profession of the scribe, as it had existed for centuries, underwent a profound and irreversible transformation. While calligraphy as an art form would endure, the role of the scribe as the primary means of reproducing lengthy texts was largely over by the early to mid-16th century in most of Europe. The quiet, meditative world of the scriptorium, with its patient, ink-stained hands, was giving way to the noisier, more industrial, and ultimately more powerful world of the printing shop. The lament was not just for a lost livelihood, but for a lost way of engaging with the very essence of the written word. We stand now at a fascinating vantage point, looking back across the decades and centuries that followed Johannes Gutenberg's pivotal invention. We've seen how the printing press wasn't merely a new way to make books more efficiently, but a profound catalyst that quietly, yet relentlessly, began to reweave the entire tapestry of daily life in late medieval and early modern Europe. Its influence was often subtle, seeping into the mundane corners of existence. But the cumulative effect was nothing short of revolutionary. It's in this widespread, often unheralded, permeation of the everyday that we find the true, enduring legacy of those early clanking presses. Think, for a moment, about the sheer increase in the presence of textual material in the environment. Before print, your average person might encounter very few written words in their daily routine. Perhaps some inscriptions in a church, a painted sign above a tavern, or the occasional official notice read aloud. Now, as the 15th century gives way to the 16th and beyond, you see printed sheets appearing with increasing frequency calendars and almanacs pinned inside cottage doors, broadsides about current events posted in market squares, cheap woodcuts with religious or moral themes decorating humble walls, printed indulgences and prayer cards changing hands, even simple advertisements for local goods or services. This growing textual saturation of the environment, even for those who couldn't yet read fluently, began to change the visual and informational landscape of daily life. The world was becoming, quite literally, more legible. Consider the impact on family life and domestic learning. While formal schooling remained out of reach for many, the availability of cheaper printed materials like primers like those horn books we mentioned, catechisms, or collections of fables created new, albeit limited opportunities for basic literacy to be taught within the home. A mother might use a printed alphabet sheet to teach her child their letters. A father might read aloud from a printed ballad or a devotional work to his family in the evening. This subtly shifted the locus of learning and piety, making the home a more active site for textual engagement. A historical fact that hints at this is the increasing mention of small, inexpensive printed books in the household inventories of even relatively modest families as the 16th and 17th centuries progressed. The presence of even one or two such items would have been a significant change from a century earlier. It's like the difference between a home with no internet access and one with even a slow dial-up connection. The potential for information inflow changes dramatically. The world of work, too, was being subtly altered beyond just the realms of high commerce or scribal professions. Think of artisans and craftsmen. While many skills were still passed down through traditional apprenticeships and oral instruction, the availability of printed manuals, pattern books, or even simple illustrated guides to new techniques or tools began to offer alternative pathways for learning and innovation. A carpenter might see a printed diagram of a new type of joint. A weaver might encounter a new pattern from a distant region, now made accessible through a printed sheet. This facilitated the spread of technical knowledge and craft skills, contributing to a more dynamic and interconnected artisanal economy. You wouldn't suddenly become a master stonemason by reading a pamphlet, but you might pick up a new trick for sharpening your chisels or a design for a more fashionable gargoyle. Darling, an artisan might say to his wife, look at this new printed pattern for a codpiece. All the rage in Flanders. It says we must make dozens. Even something as fundamental as personal identity began to be touched by print. The standardization of names and spellings, facilitated by their appearance in printed documents like tax rolls or parish registers, contributed to a more fixed sense of individual identity. The very concept of authorship became more prominent as writers saw their names attached to multiple identical copies of their works. Fostering a new sense of intellectual property, though copyright laws were still a long way off and printers often cheerfully pirated successful texts, a quirky and perhaps slightly unsettling tidbit is the role of print in standardizing and disseminating information about witchcraft and demonology in the 16th and 17th centuries. Infamous texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, were printed and widely circulated, providing a terrifyingly detailed guide to identifying, interrogating, and prosecuting alleged witches. While print could spread enlightenment, it could also amplify fear and superstition with devastating efficiency. Historians often emphasize that the impact of the printing press on daily life was not a sudden cataclysm, but a slow, evolutionary burn with profound regional and social variations. It took generations for literacy to become widespread, for the cost of books to fall within reach of the truly poor, and for the new modes of communication to fully supplant older oral and manuscript traditions. Furthermore, the debate continues regarding the extent to which print truly democratized knowledge or simply created new forms of elite control and popular manipulation. What is undeniable, however, is that by the time the medieval period fully gave way to the early modern era, the printing press had irrevocably altered the informational DNA of European society. Daily life was more saturated with text, more connected to distant events and ideas, more standardized in its communication, and more open to both the wonders of new knowledge and the anxieties of new controversies. The quiet clatter that began in Gutenberg's workshop had set in motion a cascade of changes that would touch almost every facet of how ordinary people lived, worked, worshipped, learned, and understood their place in an expanding and increasingly complex world. The ink was truly everywhere, truly. And so, as the imaginary whir and clank of those early printing presses fade into the gentle quiet of your room, we leave behind that fascinating era of transition. The world, once primarily heard and seen, was slowly, inexorably becoming a world also read. The journey from precious, handcrafted manuscript to the mass-produced printed page was not just a technological shift. It was a profound alteration in the currents of human experience, touching lives in ways both grand and intimately small. The anxieties of the scribe, the excitement of the first pamphleteers, the slow dawn of wider literacy, these were all part of that quiet revolution. As these echoes of the past recede, allow your mind to find its own stillness. The torrent of information that the printing press unleashed continues in ever new forms today. But for now, you can let that torrent flow by. May your thoughts be calm, your breathing easy, and your sleep be as deep and untroubled as a perfectly bound, unopened book, resting peacefully on a silent shelf, awaiting the light of a new day. End of script. Sweet dreams.